The world that first received Alan Scott was a world that needed symbols more than people. It was a landscape still arranging itself after rupture, cities rebuilding their silhouettes, institutions polishing their surfaces, narratives searching for figures that could hold them upright. In that terrain, heroism was not merely admired. It was required. The culture did not ask who a man was in private. It asked what he could represent in public, how clean the outline looked from a distance, how stable the image remained under pressure. Alan Scott emerged inside that demand, not as an individual searching for coherence, but as a figure shaped to occupy a visible center. The Green Lantern was not born from intimacy or confession. He was assembled as a function, a force that promised order, continuity, reassurance. The costume, the ring, the oath, all of it operated as architecture, a structure meant to carry weight. The myth did not invite ambiguity. It relied on clarity. It required a surface that reflected certainty back to a society anxious about fracture. At that moment, identity functioned as territory. What was shown belonged to the city square. What was hidden belonged to the margins. Desire was not discussed as an inner landscape. It was regulated as a risk factor. Masculinity moved through narrow corridors, carefully reinforced by repetition and ritual. The heroic body was expected to face outward, never inward. The public gaze operated like a constant spotlight, flattening complexity into silhouette. Alan Scott learned to inhabit that light. He learned the posture that kept the myth intact. He learned the angles that avoided distortion. His presence stabilized the room. His image reassured the perimeter. Nothing about the system demanded self-examination. Everything demanded consistency. The myth was not cruel. It was efficient. It offered belonging in exchange for silence. The ring itself functioned as a promise of mastery, a controlled conduit of power, disciplined by will, obedient to command. But it also mirrored the deeper logic of the era. Power was acceptable when channeled through form. Energy was safe when bound by rules. Anything uncontained threatened collapse. The same principle applied to the inner life. Desire that could not be publicly named was treated as excess. Excess was treated as danger. In this world, the self was divided by necessity. Public identity carried the weight of collective expectation. Private experience retreated into shadow, not because it was weak, but because it was incompatible with the structure above it. Alan Scott did not invent this division. He inherited it. The culture handed him a role already fortified against deviation. There was no immediate crisis, no singular event that cracked the surface. The tension was architectural. It existed in the alignment itself. The Green Lantern stood at the center of a system that rewarded coherence while quietly punishing difference. The contradiction did not announce itself as pain. It announced itself as maintenance, a continuous adjustment, a careful calibration, a life spent reinforcing walls that could not be seen. The myth demanded permanence. It demanded that the figure remain legible across time, across audiences, across shifting moral climates. Sexuality, when it did not align with the accepted template, became something that threatened legibility, not because it weakened the hero, but because it complicated the symbol. Complexity introduced questions. Questions destabilized icons. Alan Scott became a guardian not only of others, but of the image itself. The suppression was not framed as sacrifice. It was framed as duty. Preservation of the myth was presented as preservation of order. The internal cost remained unnamed, diffuse, spread across years of repetition. The shadow did not erupt. It accumulated. Visibility operated as pressure. Every appearance reinforced the boundary between what could be seen and what must remain unspoken. The heroic persona expanded, polished by use, while the suppressed identity contracted into a private interior space that had no language in the public sphere. The more the symbol succeeded, the heavier the division became. This was not a story about secrecy in the conventional sense. It was about displacement, about an identity pushed out of the center and relocated to the margins of the self. The hero did not lie. He performed. Performance became survival. Survival became habit. Habit solidified into structure. The culture watching Alan Scott did not perceive absence. It perceived stability. The myth functioned precisely because it erased the need to look closer. The audience saw what it expected to see. Strength without ambiguity. Virtue without complication. Desire aligned with norm. Anything else remained offstage. Yet even offstage, forces do not disappear. They press. They adapt. They wait. The shadow does not seek attention. It seeks balance. And in a system built on suppression, balance is deferred, not resolved. Alan Scott's story begins before any explicit revelation, before any confrontation with the terms that would later reshape his narrative. It begins in a world that required him to be a foundation rather than a question, a pillar rather than a person. The conflict was already embedded in the role. The myth stood tall. The cost remained invisible. For now. Alan Scott's origin does not function like a beginning in the conventional sense. It behaves more like an installation of forces already in motion. He does not arrive as a blank subject discovering power. He is positioned as a stabilizing element within a cultural architecture that predates him. The accident that grants him access to power is framed as destiny, but destiny here is not intimate. It is structural. He becomes the bearer of an energy that requires discipline, clarity, and control, mirroring the expectations placed upon the man who wields it. The early construction of Alan Scott emphasizes reliability over exploration. His moral compass is clear. His posture is upright. His motivations align seamlessly with the social order that surrounds him. This alignment is not coincidence. It is selection. The narrative chooses a figure capable of carrying symbolic weight without bending under contradiction. In this sense, the hero is less an individual than a load-bearing column within a larger mythic building. Sexuality within that structure is not articulated as identity. It is treated as background noise, something assumed rather than examined. Heteronormativity operates as an invisible foundation. It does not announce itself. It simply organizes space. What fits moves freely. What does not fit must relocate or compress. For Alan Scott, this compression begins early, not through explicit prohibition, but through absence. There is no place in the heroic architecture where his desire could stand without destabilizing the form. The persona that forms around him functions as a mask, but not in a theatrical sense. It is closer to a uniform, something worn continuously until it no longer feels external. The Green Lantern identity becomes synonymous with moral certainty, civic virtue, and disciplined masculinity. Each of these qualities reinforces the others. Together, they form a closed loop that resists intrusion. Desire that diverges from the implied norm does not find opposition. It finds no language. This absence of language is crucial. Without vocabulary, experience cannot enter public space. It remains pre-symbolic, felt but unspoken. Alan Scott's internal life is not denied. It is untranslated. The narrative world around him does not offer mirrors in which that aspect of the self can recognize itself. As a result, identity becomes asymmetrical. One side receives constant reinforcement through action, recognition, and repetition. The other is relegated to internal negotiation. Power in this system is deeply tied to coherence. The ring responds to will, but will itself is framed as focused intention, free of internal contradiction. This framing subtly enforces a split. To wield power effectively, the self must appear unified. Fragmentation is treated as weakness. Ambivalence is treated as risk. The hero learns to streamline his inner world, prioritizing what serves function over what seeks expression. This dynamic creates a hierarchy within the psyche. The public-facing identity occupies the center. It is rewarded, affirmed, amplified. The private identity recedes, becoming peripheral. Not erased, but displaced. Over time, displacement hardens into structure. The hero does not consciously suppress desire. He organizes his life in ways that render it irrelevant to the dominant narrative. Culturally, this reflects a broader pattern. Mid-20th century heroic fiction operated as reassurance technology. It offered clear binaries in a world experiencing rapid change. Masculinity was presented as stable, legible, forward-facing. Sexual ambiguity threatened that stability, not because it was immoral, but because it complicated the image. Complexity introduced friction. Friction slowed momentum. Alan Scott's narrative foundations are built on this economy of clarity. He is framed as a man who knows who he is, long before he has been allowed to explore who he might be. The myth assumes completion. It does not accommodate becoming. In doing so, it transforms identity into performance. The longer the performance continues, the harder it becomes to distinguish it from the self. The psychological cost of this arrangement is not immediate distress. It is gradual alienation, a sense that certain rooms within the self remain uninhabited, not forbidden, simply unused. The hero moves through the same corridors repeatedly, reinforcing familiarity while leaving other spaces dark. The darkness is not dramatic. It is quiet. It accumulates. This internal asymmetry mirrors the external narrative economy. The audience is offered a figure of strength without fracture. In return, it projects stability onto him. The hero becomes a container for collective reassurance. His image absorbs cultural anxiety. His consistency provides relief. The more effective the container becomes, the less space remains for internal divergence. It is important to note that this suppression is not framed as tragedy within the narrative. It is framed as professionalism, as maturity, as self-control. Alan Scott is admired precisely because he does not deviate. The admiration reinforces the behavior. The loop tightens. What begins as adaptation becomes identity. The foundations of this conflict are therefore not rooted in personal shame or moral conflict. They are rooted in incompatibility between lived experience and symbolic function. The myth requires a certain shape. The self exceeds that shape. The excess has nowhere to go. By the time tension begins to surface, the architecture is already complete. The walls are reinforced. The center is fortified. What follows is not the emergence of something new, but the pressure of something long contained, pressing against a structure that was never designed to accommodate it. The conflict does not announce itself through rupture. It enters through continuity. Alan Scott's life advances as expected, through victories, public trust, and symbolic reinforcement. Each appearance strengthens the myth's hold on the cultural center. The Green Lantern is not questioned. He is relied upon. His presence stabilizes the narrative space, creating a sense that order is not only possible but already secured. Yet it is precisely this stability that begins to generate pressure. The system rewards repetition, and repetition narrows possibility. Alan Scott's role becomes increasingly defined by what must remain consistent rather than what might evolve. The heroic function demands predictability. The ring responds best when intention is clean, when purpose is unambiguous. The more the hero succeeds, the more deviation feels like risk. Moments that could invite introspection are redirected into action. Conflict is externalized. Threats arrive from outside the perimeter, allowing internal tension to remain unexamined. The narrative offers endless arenas in which strength can be demonstrated without requiring self-exposure. Each battle resolves outwardly, while leaving the interior untouched. This pattern reinforces the division between function and feeling. Culturally, the audience participates in this reinforcement. Readers do not ask what the hero desires when the city is quiet. They ask whether he will arrive in time. The spotlight remains fixed on utility. What does not serve the immediate narrative disappears into shadow. The hero becomes a site of projection, absorbing collective ideals while suppressing personal specificity. As the years pass, the accumulation becomes noticeable, not as pain, but as weight. The performance requires maintenance. Relationships are framed in ways that preserve legibility. Intimacy is managed rather than explored. Emotional proximity is allowed only insofar as it does not destabilize the image. Desire, when it surfaces, is rerouted, rationalized, deferred. This is not denial in the dramatic sense. It is prioritization. Alan Scott learns to treat certain impulses as secondary, not forbidden, simply unnecessary. The hierarchy within the self becomes normalized. The public identity occupies the center of gravity. Everything else orbits at a distance. Over time, orbit feels like absence. The ring itself begins to function as a symbolic mirror. It responds to will, but will is now shaped by avoidance. The hero does not consciously think about what he is not doing. He thinks about what must be done. The system rewards this focus. Power flows smoothly. The myth remains intact. The cost remains deferred. Yet deferral is not resolution. The suppressed identity does not vanish. It adapts. It becomes quieter, more internal, more diffuse. It influences choices indirectly, through hesitation, through displacement, through subtle distance from certain forms of connection. The hero appears complete, but the completeness is architectural, not organic. This stage of the conflict is defined by imbalance without collapse. The structure holds, but strain is evident in its rigidity. Flexibility decreases. The myth grows heavier as it ages, less capable of absorbing variation. What once felt like stability begins to resemble confinement, though the narrative does not yet acknowledge it as such. Alan Scott continues to function as intended. The city remains safe. The symbol remains legible. But the internal territory becomes increasingly partitioned. The center grows brighter. The margins grow darker. The system moves forward, unaware that its greatest strength, its resistance to ambiguity, is also the condition that ensures future fracture. The conflict has not yet taken shape as confrontation. It exists as pressure, as accumulation, as a narrowing of options. The hero stands firmly at the center of the myth. The shadow waits, not in rebellion, but in persistence. The system begins to strain when continuity can no longer absorb change. Alan Scott's world does not collapse suddenly. It shifts. Cultural expectations evolve, not uniformly, but unevenly, introducing fractures in what was once a seamless surface. The heroic myth remains in place, yet the environment around it starts to reconfigure. New narratives appear at the periphery. New identities claim space that once did not exist. The center holds, but it no longer commands the entire field. This shift does not immediately liberate the suppressed self. Instead, it sharpens the contrast. What was once invisible becomes merely unacknowledged. Alan Scott occupies a strange position within this altered landscape. He is still revered as a foundational figure, a relic of stability, a symbol that predates the current moment. His longevity amplifies his mythic weight, but it also fossilizes his image. The more he represents history, the less room there is for transformation. Polarization begins here, not as public accusation, but as internal bifurcation. The hero recognizes, however dimly, that the world now contains languages that were once unavailable. Possibilities that once had no frame now possess vocabulary, visibility, and audience. Yet these developments do not immediately integrate into his life. They exist adjacent to him, not within him. The gap between what could be spoken and what has already been performed widens. The persona resists revision. It has been reinforced by decades of projection. The audience does not simply admire Alan Scott. It depends on him remaining unchanged. The myth has accumulated emotional investment. To alter it feels, within the logic of the system, like betrayal. The hero is not only a figure. He is a repository of continuity. His consistency reassures those unsettled by cultural motion. This is where suppression transforms into active maintenance. Silence is no longer passive. It becomes a strategy. The cost of expression is now imaginable and therefore calculable. To speak would mean displacing the myth from its central position. It would require renegotiation of trust, reinterpretation of history, destabilization of the symbolic order that has grown around the figure. The weight of that consequence presses inward. Internally, the division sharpens. The suppressed identity gains clarity, not because it has been expressed, but because it is now contrasted against visible alternatives. What was once diffuse becomes defined through negation. The self recognizes what it is by observing what it is not allowed to be. This recognition does not produce relief. It produces tension. Awareness does not resolve suppression. It intensifies it. Narratively, this manifests as rigidity. Alan Scott becomes increasingly associated with tradition, with legacy, with the past that must be preserved. His role is framed as guardianship, not evolution. He protects foundations. He does not remodel them. The myth organizes itself defensively, drawing sharper boundaries between center and margin. The hero stands at the center of that defense, whether he intends to or not. Relationships reflect this polarization. Intimacy remains carefully structured. Emotional proximity is permitted within controlled parameters. The possibility of desire that would require public acknowledgement is avoided not through fear, but through calculation. The hero understands the symbolic cost. He understands that once the boundary is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. The myth does not accommodate partial revelation. It demands coherence. The audience, too, becomes polarized. Some continue to project stability onto the figure, clinging to the familiar outline. Others begin to read absence as presence, sensing what has been excluded rather than what has been shown. The same silence produces different interpretations depending on the observer's position within the cultural field. The myth becomes contested terrain. This contestation does not erupt immediately. It simmers. The hero remains publicly unchanged, but the narrative around him grows denser, layered with unspoken questions. The pressure is no longer solely internal. It is distributed across the system. The spotlight that once flattened complexity now begins to refract it, casting shadows that suggest depth rather than conceal it. At this stage, neutrality becomes impossible. To remain unchanged is itself a position. The absence of declaration functions as reinforcement of the existing order. Alan Scott does not choose polarization. He embodies it. His continued silence aligns him with preservation, whether or not preservation reflects his internal truth. The conflict has now taken shape. It is no longer latent. It structures perception. Every appearance, every action, every reaffirmation of the myth carries added weight. The hero stands at the intersection of competing symbolic demands, holding a form that no longer fits the space it occupies. The fracture has not yet broken the surface, but it has reached the load-bearing beams. What follows is no longer a question of whether the structure will change. It is a question of how the change will register, and who will bear the cost when the accumulated pressure finally forces a shift. When the fracture finally registers, it does not arrive as spectacle. It arrives as recontextualization. Alan Scott does not suddenly become someone else. The myth does not shatter. Instead, the narrative is forced to look backward and notice what had been structured out of view. The conflict surfaces not through explosive revelation, but through the slow realization that continuity itself has been curated. The moment is less about confession than about exposure of architecture. What changes is not the man's inner life, but the framework through which that life has been interpreted. The heroic image remains recognizable, but it can no longer claim neutrality. The absence that once functioned as silence is now legible as omission. The center of the myth does not move, but the ground beneath it shifts. This is where consequence becomes unavoidable. The symbolic order that protected Alan Scott now demands explanation. The persona that once operated as a stabilizing force begins to reveal its cost. The public is not confronted with a new truth, but with an old one that had been systematically displaced. The tension does not arise from contradiction, but from belated visibility. Psychologically, this is not a moment of liberation. It is a moment of collision. The suppressed identity does not integrate smoothly into the established structure. It disrupts it. Years of adaptation cannot be undone by acknowledgement alone. The internal hierarchy resists inversion. The public self remains dominant, but it is now accompanied by a shadow that refuses to remain peripheral. The myth reacts defensively, not out of malice, but out of inertia. Symbols resist reinterpretation because reinterpretation destabilizes their function. Alan Scott's legacy as a foundational hero becomes both shield and obstacle. His history is invoked to frame the present, to contextualize difference as anomaly rather than continuity. The system attempts to preserve coherence by isolating the new information rather than allowing it to reorganize the whole. This produces a peculiar tension. The hero is no longer invisible as a subject, but he is still constrained as a symbol. The narrative allows acknowledgement without surrendering control. Identity is named, but carefully contained. The center absorbs the shock without collapsing, yet the absorption leaves residue. Something has been introduced that cannot be fully neutralized. Culturally, the response fractures along familiar lines. For some, the revelation functions as repair, an overdue correction that allows the myth to breathe. For others, it registers as contamination, a disruption of a figure that was never meant to carry such complexity. The same symbol now generates opposing readings. The unity it once provided is replaced by debate. Alan Scott himself remains caught between these readings. The internal landscape does not suddenly resolve. The years of suppression have shaped perception, behavior, expectation. Expression does not erase habit. It exposes it. The self must now navigate a terrain where visibility carries both recognition and scrutiny. The spotlight no longer flattens. It interrogates. This stage of the conflict reveals the true nature of the cost. Suppression preserved the myth, but it also delayed integration. The delay transformed potential fluidity into rigidity. What might have been absorbed gradually now arrives as disruption. The structure holds, but only by redistributing stress elsewhere. Narratively, Alan Scott becomes a site of symbolic negotiation rather than resolution. His identity is no longer simply personal nor purely mythic. It exists at the intersection of history and revision. The hero does not transcend the conflict. He embodies its aftermath. The persona and the suppressed self coexist, not harmoniously but irreversibly. The ring, once a symbol of disciplined will, now reflects a different tension. Power remains accessible, but its meaning shifts. Control no longer signifies unity. It signifies endurance. The hero continues to function, but the function carries visible strain. The myth persists, but it has been marked. This marking does not weaken the figure. It alters its resonance. Alan Scott is no longer merely a foundation. He becomes a fault line, a place where the pressures of past and present meet without fully reconciling. The conflict does not end here. It stabilizes into form. What follows is not collapse nor triumph. It is sedimentation. The consequences of suppression are now woven into the legacy itself, ensuring that the myth can never again be read as seamless. The structure stands, but its fractures are now part of its meaning. Once the conflict moves beyond the figure of Alan Scott, it begins to reveal its true scale. What initially appeared as a personal negotiation between identity and role expands into a cultural examination of how myths are built, maintained, and defended. The hero no longer functions solely as a character within a narrative. He becomes a diagnostic surface, a place where collective assumptions about masculinity, power, and legitimacy are tested under sustained pressure. The revelation does not simply add information to the myth. It alters the conditions under which the myth is consumed. The audience is forced to confront the fact that symbols are not neutral containers. They are curated constructions. Every absence implies a choice. Every continuity implies exclusion. Alan Scott's history becomes a case study in how cultural systems reward conformity not by force, but by visibility. What is amplified becomes real. What remains unspoken is treated as non-existent. This shift destabilizes the relationship between audience and icon. For decades, the Green Lantern functioned as a shared reference point, a stable image that different generations could project onto without friction. Once the suppressed identity becomes visible, projection encounters resistance. The figure no longer absorbs meaning effortlessly. He reflects it back, fractured. The audience must now negotiate its own expectations rather than relying on inherited assumptions. The cultural response reveals a familiar pattern of symbolic tribalism. Some readers reinterpret the entire history through the lens of revelation, finding coherence in what was previously invisible. Others isolate the acknowledgement as an external addition, something appended rather than integrated. This division does not arise from the content itself, but from the role the myth once played. Stability had become an emotional resource. Any disruption to that resource feels like loss. At the center of this reaction lies a deeper anxiety about permanence. Myths promise continuity across time. They offer reassurance that certain structures endure regardless of cultural flux. Alan Scott's transformation threatens that promise, not because it introduces change, but because it reveals that change was always present, merely suppressed. The discomfort stems from realizing that permanence was achieved through omission. Symbolically, the hero's body becomes contested territory. His image is no longer a smooth surface. It carries layers. The spotlight that once erased depth now exposes it. This exposure forces the culture to confront the cost of its own myth-making. The question is no longer whether a hero can be gay. It is whether a culture can tolerate complexity at the center of its symbolic order. The impact extends beyond sexuality. Alan Scott's narrative becomes emblematic of all identities that were historically displaced to preserve coherence. The mechanism is the same. Silence framed as professionalism, absence framed as neutrality, suppression framed as maturity. The hero's story exposes how these framings operate not as moral judgments, but as structural necessities within certain symbolic economies. Media circulation amplifies this effect. The discussion does not remain confined to the page. It echoes across platforms, communities, reinterpretations. Each retelling emphasizes a different facet of the conflict. Some focus on representation, others on legacy, others on betrayal or repair. The multiplicity of readings confirms the shift. The myth is no longer singular. It has entered a phase of fragmentation. This fragmentation does not weaken the symbol. It changes its function. Alan Scott no longer unifies by erasing difference. He unifies by hosting it. The hero becomes a site of ongoing negotiation rather than fixed meaning. This is a fundamentally different kind of cultural work. It demands engagement rather than acceptance. It resists closure. The symbolic meaning of the conflict crystallizes here. The suppression was never solely about fear of rejection. It was about preserving a system that could not accommodate contradiction without destabilizing itself. Alan Scott's delayed visibility exposes that system's limitations. The myth could survive difference only by pushing it out of sight. Once difference returns, the myth must either evolve or harden. What the culture witnesses is not resolution, but recalibration. The hero remains. The symbol persists. But the conditions of belief have changed. Audiences are now more aware of the scaffolding behind the image. The illusion of effortless coherence has been replaced by an understanding of maintenance. This awareness cannot be undone. In this sense, Alan Scott's story becomes less about identity politics and more about symbolic literacy. It teaches how myths function, how they exclude, how they adapt when exclusion becomes visible. The cultural impact lies in this exposure. The hero reveals not only himself, but the structure that shaped him. The conflict thus transcends its narrative origin. It becomes a mirror held up to a culture grappling with the limits of its own ideals. Strength without vulnerability, power without introspection, legacy without revision. Alan Scott stands at the intersection of these tensions, no longer as a solution, but as evidence. What remains is not agreement, but awareness. The myth has been altered in the collective imagination. It can no longer be consumed innocently. It demands interpretation. It demands choice. And in that demand, it fulfills a different, perhaps deeper, cultural function. What settles after the conflict is not clarity in the emotional sense, but definition in the symbolic one. Alan Scott does not emerge as a reconciled figure, nor does the myth surrounding him dissolve into openness. Instead, both enter a state of permanent tension. The story hardens into form. The legacy becomes something that must be carried rather than resolved. The hero remains foundational, but the foundation is no longer imagined as seamless stone. It is understood as layered construction. The knowledge that parts of the structure were hidden to preserve stability changes how the entire edifice is perceived. Alan Scott's place in the mythic order is not diminished. It is complicated. Complication becomes the price of continuity. The suppressed identity does not replace the persona. It coexists with it in uneven balance. Years of architectural reinforcement cannot be undone by acknowledgement alone. Habits persist. Patterns remain. The internal territory never fully reclaims what was displaced. Instead, it reorganizes around the knowledge of displacement itself. The self is altered not by freedom, but by recognition of cost. In cultural memory, Alan Scott becomes a figure marked by time, not simply because he is older, but because his narrative carries the sediment of multiple moral climates layered atop one another. He embodies a passage from an era that demanded silence to one that interrogates it. That passage does not erase the earlier structure. It exposes it as historical rather than natural. This exposure reshapes how heroism is read. The myth can no longer function as pure reassurance. It carries friction. The audience now understands that stability was achieved through exclusion, that coherence was curated rather than given. Alan Scott stands as evidence of that process. The hero no longer promises simplicity. He promises endurance under contradiction. The legacy does not belong solely to representation. It belongs to the understanding of how symbolic centers are maintained. Alan Scott's story teaches that what is preserved at the center often depends on what is pushed to the margins. When the margin returns, it does not politely integrate. It alters the geometry of the whole. Future readings of the character cannot return to innocence. Even when stories do not foreground his identity, its presence lingers as structural awareness. The myth has memory now. Silence can no longer be mistaken for neutrality. Absence can no longer be read as emptiness. Every repetition carries echo. The hero's continued existence within the narrative functions as proof that myths do not need purity to persist. They need elasticity. Alan Scott survives not because the conflict was resolved, but because it was absorbed into form. The structure holds by redistributing meaning rather than erasing tension. What remains is a figure who no longer stabilizes by standing above contradiction, but by containing it. This is a quieter kind of strength, not triumphal, not redemptive. It does not inspire through idealization, but through exposure. The hero endures as a site where history presses visibly against the present. The aftermath does not close the story, it fixes it in place. Alan Scott becomes less a character moving forward and more a landmark. A point on the map that shows where a culture once drew its boundaries and where those boundaries later failed to contain what they excluded. The myth persists. The cost remains legible. The conflict does not fade. It becomes part of the ground on which future narratives must stand.